5. We'll have to see. It may just be one of those days. Coming to church, and all of a sudden the van started dinging at me, and I was like, okay, it's just the passenger side airbag seatbelt alarm triggering. And I look down, and the temperature gauge is buried on hot, and I'm like, oh, great. Get out and look, and yeah, I can see it draining out underneath the van. So we had to real quick spin home and hopefully get home before we burned up the motor and transmission and everything like that. I think we did. So it'll be going to, as William puts it, the master of mechanisms later today to be beat back into shape.
That's right. We got plenty of room for it too. He's gotten rid of something.
And he was just telling me, oh, I gotta get rid of, take care of something else. What's the old saying goes? Before something can be done, something else must be done first.
Yes.
So Judges chapter 6. We start. The lesson's going to start in verse 25, but we'll start verse 24. It says, "Then Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord, and called it Jehovah Shalom. Unto this day it is yet in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, Take thy father's bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it." Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day, Lord. We thank you for just another day to be in your house, to hear your word spoken, Lord. I pray that you just bless the time that we have together. In your name, amen. So the little subtitle I have for verse 25 is Removing the Wrong. Well, the title of the lesson is Gideon Acts, as in action. So Gideon was given a command to remove the wrong. And the reason I started at verse 24 is because it says, okay, the Lord showed up to Gideon and said, okay, you're going to deliver Israel. And then there was the whole, brought the meal to him, and he lit it on fire with his staff. And it says, and it came to pass the same night. So when you ask God to use you, don't be surprised when he asks you to do something like right then. There will be times, God says, okay, God, I'm available. And God will say, okay, 5 minutes later, there you go. You asked, and here you go. So, and it's kind of like when you tell a friend, if you need help, just give me a call. They will never call at a convenient time. Because the convenient time for us is never. It's never going to be, oh, I don't have anything going on, don't have any plans, nothing, I'm not doing anything, and call up and I'm absolutely totally bored, and they call up and say, hey, I need your help. Oh, sure, I've got nothing going on, I'm totally bored, yeah, I'm all available. We live our lives such that, let's face it, when God asks to do something, it's going to inconvenience us in some way, shape, or form. The next point of this says, take thy father's bullock. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, there weren't many animals left in Israel. It says 7 years old. And I think, what is it, the very big top? It says, Midian had been in the land for 7 years. So they had to hide this bullock for like 7 years to keep it from the Midians. And they were scarce, and it was going to be set aside to be offered to Baal. But the point is that it was still something that was scarce and valuable, and God said, I want it. So when there will be times God will say, we should be willing that when God says, hey, you've got something that's scarce and valuable, I need you to give it to me. It could be money, time, possessions, or life. God, it says, it's maybe valuable to you, but, I need it. I need you to give it to me. It's Romans 12:1 talks about how it's our, reasonable service for what he has all done for us. We should present ourselves a living sacrifice. It's just reasonable. And the definition of reasonable is logical. It's like, yeah, as Mr. Spock would say from Star Trek, that's logical. That's the logical conclusion. That's what you would think, if you're thinking, straight. So for as much as God and Jesus Christ has done for us, it's logical that we give back to him. We owe him everything. I mean, you think back at your life before you were saved and what you were like then. Now, fast forward your life minus salvation, what you think you would be like now without Christ. Not good. And some of us are like, man, I wouldn't be still alive. So we do owe God and Jesus everything. So when it's reasonable, it's logical when God says, "Hey, you have something valuable. Of course, I gave you something infinitely more valuable." But every time God will say, "You've got something that's valuable to you. You need to give it to me for my service." And it's the next part. It says, "And throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath." Actually, throw down the altar and cut down the grove. Or let's see, this was a test for Gideon. God was like, "Okay, I'm going to call you to deliver Israel, but we're going to have to do a little bit of test here to see, will you actually obey me and do some things? Would you be willing to, Gideon? Are you going to be willing to obey God? Obey, God says, obey me, knowing that what you're going to do is going to cause you trouble." He knew that there were zealous worshipers, Baal worshipers, and this altar was his father's. So if he did as God commanded, he was going to make himself an enemy of people in his family, and he was going to make enemies of the people in the city where he lived. So he was going to be basically enemies within and without. But the thing is, if Gideon would not obey God for this, we'll call it relatively minor act, he wouldn't obey God when things started getting really bad. Throwing down an altar, cutting down a grove, having some relatives and some people mad at you, yeah, that's not great. But when it goes and dealing with a massive army of Midianites, that's a pretty small thing comparatively so. It's the same thing with our lives. God may say, "Hey, I need you to do this," what may seem like we may seem to think it's a big deal. God says, "I need you to do X," whatever it may be. And you're like, and it's a test. God says, "Are you going to obey me in this, what I view as a smaller matter?" Because if you won't obey God when it's small, you're not going to obey him when it's large. There was my boss, one of my former bosses was telling me there was a time he had I think it was maybe his father-in-law or something like that he had said that, when he got his finances all in order and he, made his pile of money, that then he would start giving to his church or start giving to a church. And even my boss, who is an unsaved man, laughed at him and said, if you don't do it now, you're not going to do it then either. So if you won't obey God when he asks you for a small thing, maybe God says, "I want you to give an extra $20 a week in tithe." I don't know. I'm just pulling hypotheticals out of the air. If you won't obey that, then God's going to be like, "If you won't obey me in the small thing, you think I'm going to be able to ask you to step up and do a role and faithfully serve in the church, or maybe call to preach or something like that?" If you're not going to obey God in the smaller stuff, you're not going to, God's going to I can't trust you with the small stuff. If I can't give $5 to Bob and expect him to use it wisely, if he goes out and spends and buys it, what's your favorite drink, Bob? Yeah, his little flavored waters are like that. He immediately goes out and wastes all his money on buying his favorite drink, and it's like, "Bob, you got that $5 for gas?" "Oh, I know, I bought it in drink." Well, we can't run the car on that. If we can't trust Bob to manage $5 to get gas in the vehicle, we're certainly not going to give him the church credit card to help run the finances of the church. And this also was God's way to show Gideon that he should do right, even if it is unpopular and can make you enemies. So what is it? Bob Jones Sr. said, do right. Even if the only way to keep the stars from falling is if to do wrong, keep doing right. Doing right, you do right not because it's popular and will make you friends. You do right because it is the right thing to do. Next part is it says, and you throw down the altar and cut down the grove. This was, a little section here I got, removing the abominable. Let's say just God didn't, let's just say, hypothetical, God didn't give Gideon this command. And then Gideon goes forth and the rest of Judges happens. And Gideon defeats the Midianites. They're thoroughly defeated. Israel is, freed from the oppression of the Midianites. And then somebody says, Gideon, you're with like the Lord God of Israel, like of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and the one who delivered us out of Egypt and all the great miracles and delivered the hand of Midianites into your hand. He says, yep, God did all of that. And they go, why do you have an altar to Baal in your backyard? It would kind of make the appearance that, Gideon wasn't following the Lord with his whole heart. It would also be a constant temptation. Just as Solomon's foreign wives led him astray, Gideon's family could slowly wear him down to worship at the family altar. This is the family time. This is when the family can get together. The lake house. Sunday is the only day that we can all get together at the lake house and get together to be a family and have family time together. Sunday's the only day. So, and you're like, man, I want to be good relations with my family, and I haven't seen someone in a while. So, just this once, I'll go to the lake house, and so I can be with family. If you leave something that's a temptation there, it will slowly wear away on you. Also, the altar and the grove were to be totally destroyed. They weren't to be just, it isn't like sometimes, sometimes kids will go and vandalize mailboxes. Like we had, there was somebody was going down years ago, going on a road vandalizing mailboxes. As they were by them, they smashed mailboxes, they, broke them off and like that. Ours, it's on a 4x4 post. They just lifted it up and threw it on the ground. So I lifted it back up and slid it back into the hole. It wasn't destroyed. I didn't have to do anything to fix it. When something, God wanted the altar and grove destroyed. When something is destroyed, it's a whole lot harder to bring it back. As compared to when it's just, you knock over the altar of Baal, okay, fine. It's just like when the Philistines captured the ark. The first night when they put the ark in front of their god Dagon, they found in the morning that Dagon was on his face before the Ark of the Covenant. So what they do? They just set him back up. Then God said, okay, you didn't learn that lesson. So the next night he cut out, it was down on his face again, and the arms and the hands and the feet were cut off, so you couldn't put it back up. So if God wants you to get rid of something in your life, it needs to be totally destroyed. Because otherwise, if just God says, if you just say, okay, I'll just, this problem in my life, I'll just knock it over. And then 6 months down the road, you know what? I'm just going to set this, that annoys me. So I'm just going over here and set it up just a little bit. And a little bit more. And pretty soon, you've set it all back up. And when something is destroyed, that means there is no remnants of it left. You could search for it and it's gone. William has made a point of this, that when he talks about the flood, the flood that happened in Noah's time, that it destroyed everything of the earth. If you look up the numbers of the population of the earth, they estimate between a low and a high number, that our numbers were between 5 and 15 billion. And what they have said is when you start getting above 3-4 billion people, you see all of our roads and infrastructure and farming and stuff that we've got going on. That's what you need to sustain a population of that size. How much of that do we find from that era? None. God destroyed it. You can't be found. So when God puts a point, something in your life that says, this needs to be destroyed, what he means is it's gone, and you can search your entire life out and you can't find any trace of it anywhere. It's gone. The next, let's see, am I in? Okay, I'm in 26. Yeah, okay, yep. 26. And build an altar unto the Lord thy God upon the top of this rock in the ordered place, and take the second bullock and offer burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. God didn't want the altar of Baal destroyed. He wanted an altar to himself put up there in its place. If the altar was just destroyed and the grove was cut down, if it's like if you just happen to go somewhere and, okay, let's just say, it's like we come to church on Wednesday and we find like the windows of the auditorium have been smashed in. There's spray paint, just random spray paint everywhere, and stuff is destroyed around the church. We chalk it up to vandalism. But if we come in on Wednesday night and everything's all been done except now, instead of just random spray paint everywhere, somebody spray painted like the Church of Satan symbols, and there's like 6. It's kind of like, okay, somebody's sending a message. When you look at it, because if the altar was just destroyed, they said it could be easily attributed to vandalism, or maybe the Midianites came through and said, I don't like the look of that altar or whatever. I'm just going to destroy it just because. But when an altar to God was put up, it's like, okay, now it was done. It wasn't just done on somebody didn't do something randomly. This was done on purpose. It was a statement. It was supposed to be meant as a statement and a rebuke to Israel, that you've forsaken God and you're worshiping Baal, and God's saying, what you're doing is wrong. And it's kind of like, it's one thing if you like partake in the world's excesses, or actually, okay, it's one thing if you do not partake in the world's excesses. If there's a group of people there and, they're all drinking and one person says, no, I don't drink, they don't really, it's not that big of a deal. They may think you're a little weird if you don't do the same things they do, but it's a whole nother matter if you start telling them, they offer you a drink, you say, oh no, but in the Bible it says, you shouldn't even look on, the stuff when it's changed itself right, and alcohol is a sin, and when you start actually, living the right, that's where your testimony, is a conviction to their wrong choices and actions. So when the altar wasn't just destroyed, but it was replaced, it's now a rebuke and a conviction to Israel that says, you've walked away and disobeyed God's commands. And it says, in the ordered place. Place means row, rank, or battle line. This kind of gives the idea of a military formation. And we are in a spiritual army fighting a spiritual war. Those, I know, William served in Vietnam. What would happen if he's been assigned with his buddy, this is your foxhole, and you're to stay here and defend from this position. What would happen if his friend goes off, says, I'm going to go back to the chow hall or something like that, and he goes off and he never comes back. And then typically from what I read, the attacks came at night, and all of a sudden the bullets start flying, and he's like, where's my companion? Where's my friend who's supposed to be here helping me? Or worse, the friend is there and the bullets start flying, and the guy says, I ain't going to die for this, and he takes off and runs. Now you've got a lone soldier sitting there who is now, they are now, when there are two or more together, it's actually a whole lot stronger than just two individual people. But when there's just one, they're vulnerable from attack from all directions. And also, there are strength in numbers being in a cohesive unit. And when the unit is fractured, the unit is no longer as strong as they can be. Let's see. Also, talking about, destroying the altar, and, God wanted an altar to himself put up. If God convicts you that there's something in your life that needs to go, you can't just say, okay, fine, I'll obey you, and I'll, throw this item out of my life. You know what you've just done? It's like digging a hole. You can dig a hole and throw the dirt off to the side, but you know what now you've got? You've got a hole there. What's going to happen to a hole? It wants to get filled in, or it's there to be tripped into. Well, you can't, it's also, Steve Currington did with the Reformers Unanimous. You just can't take away somebody's addictions and say, okay, you're good. You need to replace it and fill that addiction with something else. That's where he talks about, salvation, growing in the Lord. You need to fill the void from that addiction with godly things. Because otherwise, if you don't fill it with godly things, it'll be filled with anything else. Verse 27, I got this labeled as Gideon obeys. Then Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord said unto him. And so it was, because he feared his father's household and the men of the city, that he could not do it by day, that he did it by night. It says he took 10 men. These are servants, and they are supposed to obey. But Gideon Gideon looked at, okay, a grove, that's trees. I don't know how many of us have taken an axe and tried to cut down a tree. I mean, so modern appliances, modern tools are wonderful. Chainsaw, you just, and there you go. But have you ever had to take an axe? We had the last Sunday about, when the axe head floats, trying to cut a tree down with a dull axe head. But even a sharp axe head, trying to cut down a tree, that's a lot of work. And Gideon realized, I'm not going to be able to do this job alone, so he went and got some help. Could he have done it by himself? Oh, yeah. But it would have taken a lot longer. And as he said, he couldn't do it during the day for fear of his father's house and the men of the city. If he's trying to do it by himself, come morning, people all of a sudden hear this axe going, and they go out there and they see a third of the grove has been cut down, and there's Gideon with an axe chopping some more. They'd be like, wait a minute, Gideon, what are you doing? You can't be tearing down the grove to our God. And they would, intervene and stop him. So one of the points with that is, never be so proud that you can't ask for help. There are people that, for whatever reason, that's like, I don't ask anybody for help. Maybe they've been disappointed too many times, who knows? But they're like, I will do it myself, no matter what the issue is. It doesn't matter if it's going to wrung me ragged. I'll do it myself. It's a whole nother matter. And then for that person, it's a matter of pride that they won't ask for help. I mean, there are how many times have you heard of people that somebody tried? They were destitute, and somebody tried to help them out, and they're like, no, they were too proud to accept help. So, pride can put you in a whole lot of hurt and misery. Now, it's a whole other matter if you ask for help and nobody shows up, and then you have to do it by yourself anyway. That's just a side point. But also the verse says, cannot do it by day. Some people have read, I've heard sermons said that, Gideon did it at night because he was afraid. Well, the other way to read this is, he couldn't do it during the day because this city and his father's house were Baal worshipers. How many of us, if all of a sudden you got a text from pastor that said, we've got hooligans at the church that are too many for me to handle, and I need some men of the church here now. And all of a sudden a half dozen men of the church show up. And then, when we stop whoever's going on here. That's kind of like what Gideon's at. He's like, if I try to do something during the day, they're going to see this, and they're going to stop me, and I'm not going to be able to do what God commands. So he went and, did it at night when a time that it could be done. But the point I got from this is the world is watching you. So when the child of God lives righteously, the world notices. Partly they want to see, does your walk and your talk line up? Do what you say, does your life back up what you say? The other thing is they want to watch you because, man, they are waiting for that gotcha moment. When you do something that, they think, that's not what a Christian should do. They want that gotcha moment because they want to be able to use that as their shield against any other future Christian encounters. So they can say, I knew one Christian that, went to your church and this is how he acted. That's their shield against further witnessing. And also, when you try to live for the Lord, don't be surprised when the world goes out of the way to make your life difficult. Gideon found that out real fast. He's like, if I try to do this, they're going to make my life difficult. Verses 28 and 29 says, and when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it, and the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. Oh, the previous verses, this is a little side point. It's I don't know. I almost kind of like when it because one of the says here, verse 26 it says cut down the make and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. So it's kind of like I didn't put it in the lesson, but it's one of those things where God says, okay, you know what? I'm gonna stick it to these Baal worshipers. Not only am I going to have my altar there, and I'm going to take the sacrifice was meant for Baal, I'm going to have it sacrificed to me. I'm going to use the wood from your sacred grove as the fire on my altar. That's the way of saying, okay, yeah. It's like sticking somebody in the eye to really prove your point that, okay, yeah, I'm going to show you really what I think of you. I'm going to take everything you've got and I'm going to use it for my purposes. So, but back to verses 28 and 29. When you try to work for the Lord, it won't take long for the world to find out and be unhappy. I know even around here, there have been people that have been unhappy with things that have happened in the church. And how many times have we heard of ministries that have tried to expand and they have to go through so many legal hoops and battles? Like when we went to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, there's some sections in there where they had describing they had to go through so many legal battles just to be able to set the stuff if they did. Because the people of the world were like, we don't want this God creation stuff here. The world is never happy when the things associated with God and the church try to grow. And they will try to do what they can. They will go out of their way to make it, to try and hinder and stop it. And also, it doesn't say who told the men of the city. Only a nebulous they said. That's it. Isn't it amazing how hard it is to find the source of where a rumor or gossip started? You can talk to Don, and Don says, "Oh, I heard it from Debbie," and Debbie says, "Oh, I heard it from Patty," and Patty said, "I heard it from Bob," and Bob says, I overheard somebody talking about it. I don't remember where." Nice deniable anonymous source. It's amazing. So, one of the reasons why we shouldn't be gossiping and spreading rumors, because, when somebody actually, I think even Willen brought up the point that when somebody does bring something like that to you, you're like, thanks. Now I've got to take time to investigate this out. And instead, it's like you've raised, basically, when you bring gossip and rumor, you're basically bringing an accusation. It's like, now I've got to go investigate this to find out whether or not you're actually, it's like the old telephone game. If you go through about 6 or 7 people, what was said is nowhere near what the original phrase was. So what you find out is, like, if you investigate it all out, which, by the way, takes time and energy, by the time you get it all out, it's like you find out that wasn't the entire thing to begin with. So, verse 30 says, "Then the men of the city said unto Joash, Bring out thy son, that he may die, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, and because he hath cut down the grove that was by it." You notice that nobody was demanding death for the followers of Baal, for their wickedness. That was the law in Deuteronomy 13. It says, even if it's like your wife or your husband tries to entice you to go worship another god, your hand is to be the first one to cast the stone. You notice that no one was demanding they be executed for their wickedness. According to the world, it's okay. It's okay when you trash talk the God of the Bible. But if somebody does something that defends one of their ideas and one of their religions, they want blood. That isn't surprising. How many of us knew when we were younger, that like in school, there was like a family that they always picked on like the youngest member of their family. They tormented them, made their life miserable. But if anybody else outside the family joined in and picked on them, the whole family banded together and went after, because it's like, okay, that's our sibling and we all know they have the right to do what we do to it. That's the same thing with the world. We are not of the world's family. So when we start doing things that convicts the world's family, the world's going to band together and fight against this outsider family that's attacking and convicting one of our members. And we go to verse 31. And Joash said unto all that stood against him, will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death while it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. I titled this that God needs no defenders. All men stood against him. Joash was the head of his house, which means, his family was his responsibility. If something needed to be done inside the house, he would handle it. It's kind of like, it's like, for example, I'll use Patty as an example. She's got her granddaughter here. If her granddaughter needs to be disciplined, it's not our responsibility, anybody in this church, responsibility to discipline Tilly. We go to Patty and say, this is what has happened and this needs to be dealt with. And it's Patty's responsibility here in the church, when she has her granddaughter at church, to discipline her. It's the same thing as if, in the military, you don't go and, from another, somebody that's not in your chain of command, you don't go and choose somebody out. You go over to them and you tell them this is the problem, and they go down and take care of it themselves. That's what Joash is doing here. It's like, okay, if you think there's a problem in my household, you bring it to me and then I will deal with it. You're not going to deal with it. And also I kind of picture Joash standing on the porch of his house with his arms crossed, staring down all these guys saying, yeah, you're not getting into my house. And also, Joash asked some very pointed questions to these people. He says, okay, we're good. He says, will you plead? And plead also means defend. He said, will you plead for Baal? If Baal, they said, if Baal is a true and powerful God, why does he need you to avenge for him? Why does he need you to come here and do this? And also, will you deliver or will you save Baal? If a God needs to be saved or delivered, it isn't a very strong God. Even, especially if your defender has to be mankind. If the only reason, if your God is in trouble and he calls upon us, humanity as a whole, to defend it, that's not a very strong God. And also it says, let him be put to death. Joash is warning him that if they want the person responsible, they have to go through him. I said back earlier, he's the head of the household. His house is his responsibility. And if they want Gideon, Joash may not have liked what Gideon did, but he's like, Gideon's my family and my household. He's my responsibility. And if you want him, you're gonna have to go through me. And for us, whoever the head of the household is, they need to be ready, willing, and able to defend those in their house. And what that should also mean is that you should have courses of action already planned out so that if the need arises, you know what exactly you should do. If you're at home and, it's like for my family, my family's all through my house, upstairs, downstairs, opposite of the house. I've already got things figured out that, if I wake up in the night to breaking glass or something like that, somebody trying to not kick down my door, it's like, okay, I already know what I'm going to do. I already planned it out. There's going to be, I won't go into the details, but but you have to, the thing is, you have to think ahead of time and have a plan of action so that when the crisis happens, you're not reacting, you're acting. You're acting out what you've already decided you're going to do. Bob mentioned this the last time I did this too, is Joash doesn't seem to be a very zealous follower of Baal. As Bob put it, Joash just went along to get along. He wasn't, he's like, okay, I'm not a very zealous worshiper of the God of Israel. I'm not a very zealous worshiper of Baal. But you know what? I live in a city full of Baal worshipers, so fine. Set up a grove and just leave me alone. He didn't particularly religious man and just followed Baal because it kept people from bothering him. That's one way to look at it. Or the other way is he is an extremely zealous or firm believer in Baal, and he truly does believe in, like, why are you guys here? If Baal, Baal should be able to handle himself. But the point with this, a lot of this is the gods of this world, that we make up. Talking Baal, like, for example, we have our idols today of material things. They have no real power. I mean, there is satanic power, but as far as like the God of, like the different religions, they've got their own gods. They've got no real power. The power that they have, that they seem to have, is based on the number and fervency of their believers. How many of you have heard of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster? I think that's the name of it. Basically, it's like it looks like a mass of spaghetti that's flying, tendril flying. I see everybody kind of smiling, or Don's looking at me like, huh? And if you look it up, on weird religions, there are some doozies out there. You know what? I didn't see anybody in here quaking in their boots over a follower of the religion of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. But what would happen if you decided to go witnessing in, like, Dearborn, in the heart of Michigan Muslim territory? That's a whole different matter, because Islam has a large number of followers, and they are very fervent in their beliefs. So the God of Islam has its power because of the number of followers that it has and the fervency that they believe it. But the God of Islam, if you took away all the followers, it has no power. Whereas with God, the God of the Bible is his own power. God's power is not diminished or increased based on the number of believers that are in the world. It's kind of like somebody said, the bumper sticker that says, God and I make the majority. No. God isn't some magical, 50%, and when you join God's side, he gives them that 50.0001%, so he's now the majority. No. God is like, the 99.99 into infinity. You don't add anything to the equation. God is the majority on his own by himself. And he has his own, he is his own power. He doesn't need any of us to make his power greater. Whereas the gods of this world, they need people to actually have their power. And then finish off with verse 32. It says, therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar. Gideon gained a reputation. How many of us have known somebody that gained a nickname because it's something they did? It's like for almost for a while, he grew out of it, fortunately, but I almost gave Aaron the nickname Bump when he was growing up. Because when he was about, when he first started walking, he was like banging his head on everything. I mean, just, he used to be able to walk underneath the kitchen table. Well, now he can't. He's clipping his head right there. Or he's catching his arm or his head on the corner of the, he was just hitting his head on everything.
They have to duck to get down the stairs.
Yes. So, he almost earned a nickname because of what he did. But I'm sure there are other people, that that have earned a nickname because of what they've done. It may have only happened once, but that action stuck with them for the rest of their life. Yeah, that's Gideon. He did one thing, and he got a new name out of it, a new nickname. That means we have to be careful with what we do, because all it can take that's kind of like, I'm not sure if it's entirely accurate, but I've heard for in the fighter pilots, the nicknames they get like a holding name, and then once they finally do something incredibly brave or stupid, that's how they earn their nickname, their flight name or whatever like that. So we should be careful what we do, because it can be with us for the rest of our life. And once you have a reputation, oh man, is it hard to change it. I know there was a church over north of Morley, I think it is, that even after the pastor had changed, the pastor had changed, a whole new congregation, but somebody mentioned that church name, and it had been 15, 20 years since the new pastor had taken over, and they mentioned to somebody else, that church, all they do is fight. There probably hadn't been a church fight in 20 years, but they had a reputation. They gained a reputation, a church that just has infighting and stuff like that. So, it takes a long time, if ever, to get rid of a bad reputation. Once you get a bad reputation, man, there's always going to be somebody that's like, I remember that. And on the converse, though, it can take a long time to get a good reputation, but a good reputation can be easily destroyed with a single bad act. So we have to be very careful, guard our steps, guard our mouth, because it doesn't take much to gain a reputation. And especially now, everybody's got their video cameras. It's like yesterday I got new dash cams in my car, stuff like that. If somebody, how often do you see dash cam videos of somebody, driving, erratically or crazy on the road? Their car, and especially if they find out who it is immortalized on the internet until the internet goes down. Their actions will now haunt them for the rest of their life. So we have to be careful on how we act, basically all the time, because if you never know who's going to watch, and you never know what's going to stick around and gain you a reputation. So, but that's the end of verse 32, and we are done. So let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day, Lord. We thank you for your word. I pray, Lord, that you would use this lesson, Lord. Also use the services later today, Lord, that you would use it to make us grow closer to you, Lord. In your